Well, hello, students, and welcome to your first Chapter 1, Lesson 1 video notes. Now, throughout these video note lessons, remember a couple important tools. You can stop or pause this video at any time. You can also go back and rewatch in case you missed anything. So throughout these video notes, I would like everyone to have their packet out on Chapter 1, Lesson 1, and really be filling in the information as the blanks come upon. So in your first Chapter 1, what does a historian do? We're going to figure out what people that study history specifically do. And we're also going to help define what is history and why history matters. So history are events of the past created and lived in history and make decisions for the future. Now, why study history? What does this have to do with me? History, the study of people and events of the past. History helps explain why things are the way they are. So in order to figure out why we live in the current world we do, it's important to study the past. But why? History helps us understand the present and make better choices. History also helps us understand how we fit into the human story, where we are currently in the world today.
All right, so now you know why we should study history, but historians had to have a way to break down all of the things that happened so that we're all talking about the same thing at the same time. So if a historian in China wants to talk about an event that happened in Africa, and a historian in Africa wants to talk about that event too, they want to put it in the same time schedule so that we all are working on the same time and they are talking about the same event. So we had to come up with some words that would be the same for everybody. And the first word we want to talk about is a decade. A decade is 10 years. So that's just 10 years, just like you got 10 fingers, 10 years, a decade. It's like a decimal point. That's 1/10 of a dollar or 1/10 of 100, the decimal point. So there's 10 years right there. So then the next increment of time that they decided upon was a century. 100 years, 10 times 10. So you would get 100 years. And so that's a century. Then there's a third increment of time that they came up with, and we call that a millennium. That's like every 1,000 years, there's a millennium. And so that's what 10 times 10 times 10 is a millennium. So you have a decade, a century, and a millennium. And now these are common numbers that we can use to discuss how the passage of time happens. And so after they discovered the words they were going to use, we decided to set up and put the big millenniums into eras. And an era is a long period of time, and it's marked by common events. Like all of the architecture and things surrounding the Greek world, we call that the Greco-Roman era, because Greece and Rome are kind of the same. Then we have the medieval era. That's where we had castles and knights and feudal systems and lands and things like that. And kings, and just lots of exciting things happened in moats around our castles. Just a lot of fun stuff, and we classify that the medieval time period. But then there's also, and I'm sorry that I'm covering up, maybe I can move that and you'll be able to see it. But there's the technology era. You can see the little mouse there in the keyboard. And we classify that as like our era today, where we have such technology and tools that help us do a job. So technology is really just any old tool that helps us do something better. And so technology era, you can move it after you get there. All right, so we want to continue talking about time. And so if you measure times in months and in minutes and then days and then months, eventually all those add up to lots of years. And so we have a way to measure those, and we measure them, hopefully, let's see, we can measure that on the minutes would add up to days, and then the days are going to add up to months, and then all that time is going to add up to lots of time that passes. You get to decades and then centuries and then millennia and then eras, and it just keeps getting bigger and bigger. And so we had to have a way to understand that time as it passes, and that's on the timeline. The timeline was created by the Roman Catholic Church. And at that time, they were the ones who were in charge. And since the Roman Catholic Church believed that Jesus was the center of everything they did, they made his birth the center of the timeline. So anything that happened before Jesus was born is considered BC, before Christ. Anything that happens after Jesus was born is considered AD, Anno Domini, in the year of our Lord. So it's after the birth of Jesus Christ. So some people think sometimes that it is the death of Jesus Christ, and that's not correct. Because Jesus, historically, they think Jesus died when he was 33. And so then that would have to be the year 33 in the middle, not the year 1. And that's where we start. And so the Roman Catholic Church had it set up this way. But then as time went on, not everybody thought that Jesus was the center of the world anymore, and he wasn't the center of everything that was going on. They wanted another way to refer to these things. So scientists and different people in the Common Era, this is where we live today, I'd say in the last 25, maybe up to 50 years, they started with BCE. That's before the Common Era, which still refers to before Jesus was born. It was before this time, but it's before the Common Era because we all now live in the Common Era, which is after year 1. Year 1 is still the center of time, but it's just marked in a religious and a non-religious way. So BC and BCE mean the exact same thing. AD and CE mean the exact same thing. Please circle AD. I want you to circle that right now because that is the one that all kids miss. That's the common one because they think that it's after death, but it is not. It is after the birth of Jesus Christ. All right, guys, I will see you in class. Good job.
So now we're going to talk about digging up the past. So in your video notes packet, you have a graphic organizer here. You're going to be doing some filling in and a little bit of drawing. So you have a tool of history, which is an artifact. The definition of that is an object made by people. So for instance, in today's technology or today's world, a cell phone would be an artifact because it is made by people. So what you need to do in the next box is draw an example or list. It's actually asking for 2. So draw or list 2 of an example of an artifact. Your next box is showing you that a non-example, which is something that is not an example of an artifact, is a skeleton and what looks like it used to be the imprint of a foot of an animal. So a skeleton is not made by people. Okay, so that would be a non-example. Your next tool of history is a fossil, and that definition states the remains of plant and animal life that have been preserved from an earlier time. So you would need to draw your example of a fossil that is something that used to be living, and then you would draw or list your non-examples, something that is not a fossil. So for instance, maybe something that was more along the lines of an artifact would go in the non-example for fossil. And then here in your box it says, did you know paleontologists are scientists who study fossils? Archaeologists are scientists who study artifacts. So they are studying items or objects that are made by people. And now for the last part of lesson 1. This is your hot question. This is a higher order thinking question. This is never a question that you're going to answer with a few simple words. This is always going to be requiring you to think on a higher level, to piece information together to form an answer. So this hot question is asking you to name one example of how the past influences life today. Now, this is not where you just write what that example is. So, for instance, if I said something from the past that influences life today, for me, if I said going to college, I am not just going to write my example as going to college. You need to give your example, but then you need to list 3 ways that it has impacted your life. So that translates into a minimum of 3 sentences. It should be more like 5, but you would be at a minimum of 3 sentences. These need to be complete thoughts, correct grammar, punctuation, restate the prompt. So you'd want to start it out with an example of how the past influences life today is, and then you write what that example is, and then after that, you give your 3 pieces of evidence. Okay, that's it for us. Bye.